My name is Fred Tebow. I'll open this. I did want to say, with the mayor listening, Mayor, I think your Park and Rec job people are doing an outstanding job here. What they've done, the monuments, the loam, the grass, the flowers, it looks fabulous. Let's give the mayor a hand, would you?
But it's the workers over there who did it.
And those are the folks over there that did it, but they appreciate the mayor knows about it. Okay, so I'm speaking very close into the mic, and I'll turn this over without further. Well, we're going to pay particular attention to Ukraine. Particular attention to Ukraine. So this may be a Hashoah remembrance unlike any other you've seen so far. With this, I'll turn this over to Rabbi Jonathan Sparrow-Servet. He's going to be noisy.
Is this working at all? In and out? Okay. Good afternoon, everyone, and my appreciations too to Mayor Donchis and the city, to Alderman T-Boom, who's been our leader and my partner in this annual gathering, and Carol and honored guests and community members. Today is known in the Jewish calendar as the Day of Remembrance for the Holocaust and Heroism, Yom HaZikaron LaShoah VeLaGvura, or just Yom HaShoah. Every day is a memorial anniversary day for the Shoah, for someone who was murdered or died in the Nazi Holocaust. And today marks also by the Jewish calendar the anniversary of an uprising by Jews against the Nazis in the Warsaw Ghetto. I have words, and they're different at two occasions today, at this civic gathering and tonight's more religious and community gathering convened by Catholics and Jews at Riviere University at 7. And I want to invite all of you to participate there, to come there, or to get there by Zoom through the synagogue website or however else you may have found out. And while I'll speak tonight more in my religious kippah as a Jew and a rabbi, here I want to start us off in a different voice, in my related but different hats as a civic leader in town and president of the Nashua Area Interfaith Council and a member of the New Hampshire State Commission on Holocaust and Genocide Education. But some words are for both gatherings and are really almost beyond words, and that is just to remember and to honor every single one of the people who was murdered by the Nazis in the Holocaust, and to stand in mourning with their families, and to honor survivors and their families, and rescuers and their families. Jews, Roma, queer, disabled, political opponents, religious dissenters, children and adults, millions and millions, lives taken in a machinery of lies and hate and murder. My family, my wife's family, and many of yours. Eni Yordamayim. As the words attributed to the prophet Jeremiah say in the book of Lamentations, my eyes flow with tears. I tremble that what I say here and what I do here today will not honor them enough. I tremble with every bite I have eaten today, that I had the privilege of eating, that I woke up in a comfortable bed. I tremble that I will not be grateful enough to be alive and living in this place, that I may have wasted a day in a way that does not honor those who died. I beg their forgiveness, and I beg yours who are mourning, and I try to say a few words. Let's try it this way.
Do it without the mic.
This, yeah? Here we go. Is there something? University, home for elders, Holocaust monument, shopping center, learning center, middle school, hospital, city hall. City hall, hospital, middle school, learning center, shop, no, now we can't hear it all.
Speak louder.
Speak louder. Shopping center, Holocaust monuments, home for elders, university. That is the spine of our city and the thoroughfare of our democracy. And one of these things may be not like the others. In the middle of this boulevard of humanity and compassion is this Holocaust memorial, this intrusion of atrocity from across the world that most of the time I just want to hurry by. And indeed, that is what I usually do. But this Holocaust memorial is not an intrusion. It more than belongs here. It is essential. The recognition of the Holocaust is part and parcel, in some ways, is the center of this boulevard, a testimony to the urgency of our democracy and to every facet of it. The Shoah was not just about hate, and the antidote is not just tolerance. The Shoah was not just about cruelty, and the answer is not only kindness. Education of children and young adults and adults of all ages, care for our sick and our elders and our vulnerable, the voice of our citizens in making our laws and watching over our city, these together are the answer, the essential antidotes, the things that have to be nurtured and make up the democratic community, that we have to love with all our hearts and all our souls and all our might, with our lives and our fortunes and our sacred honor. The dark black mirror of this monument, where we see ourselves as potential victims and potential perpetrators, where we can see our souls dimmed and eyes blinded by the difficulties of life and the wearying responsibility of looking out for each other. There is a time to look at that mirror to remind ourselves what is at stake and why this community and this democracy is so dear. This year we are gathering while across the globe once again are atrocities and crimes and falsehoods in Ukraine, perpetrated by Putin and his regime. We are not many months away from our abandonment of the people of Afghanistan, who we left to the mercy of tyrants. Our local Rohingya neighbors continue to be subject, their families, by atrocities in the military in Myanmar, a continuation of what our government has only recently acknowledged as a genocide. We remember this month officially the genocide of Armenians more than a century ago. We stand here on the traditional territory of the Pawtucket people and part of the Wabanaki and Dawnland Confederacy, whose stewardship of this land we honor, and we acknowledge our country's atrocities and genocide. Democracy saves lives. Democracy saves our souls and prevents us from turning on each other. Democracy is the answer for when we are scared, when we think we're scared of each other but we shouldn't be, when we are actually scared of each other and we shouldn't be, and when we have good reason to be scared of others in our community. Freedom and truth and democracy go together. Truth about ourselves should not frighten us. Truth about the world, it will strengthen us. Lies about any of it and lies about ourselves lead to there. Nazism was just not about hate, it was about lies. It was an industry of death and a whole architecture. It emerged from a democracy that was not complete. What is more powerful and more beautiful is the democracy and freedom and truth and love of our democracy and love of each other, even when that's hard. I love you, my fellow citizens, who sometimes contend with me and often don't understand me, and who I often do not understand. It is hard to love and live that way, but there is nothing left than life-saving work, and there is no greater obligation than to save lives. And against all of that is America, the America we are striving for, the democratic ideal, and it is our responsibility to build it beyond just tolerance and coexistence, which we have learned are not enough. It is our responsibility because if Ukraine teaches us anything and Weimar Germany teaches us anything, it is that the line between life and death is very thin, between together and tearing each other apart. If we stop seeing each other as part of the same community, that is where the tracks lead. I have great faith that there are enough of us who believe that and are willing to engage more deeply than those who are afraid of confronting our past and our current frailties. I have great belief and faith in our Constitution and our institutions, that they open up to this great boulevard. So today we will hear some words, we'll talk about the past, we'll talk about the present in Ukraine. We invite you to walk in this monument, and perhaps Fred will guide you. We'll gather, if you wish, to talk afterwards about what it is that we should be doing today, we could be doing in our world for Ukraine and other places. University, home for elders, Holocaust monument, shopping center, learning center, middle school, hospital, city hall. These are our answer to the Shoah. These are the antidote and how we say never again. These are how we will honor those who were murdered and those who died, those who survived and those who lost, those who fought and those who rescued. Thank you all for being here.
Well, the next speaker is our mayor. Mayor, we're very grateful of your participation. This monument, this memorial is truly a partnership between private and government, a successful partnership between private interests and government interests. We thank you, Mayor. And you're the next speaker.
Well, I'm honored to be here today to recognize Yom Hashoah. And I want to thank Fred T-Boom, and Rabbi Spiros Savet for inviting me. Nashua is fortunate to be the home to the only public Holocaust memorial in the state of New Hampshire. And that is thanks to the efforts of Fred T-Boom. We're fortunate to be able to gather here every year. So many around the world are not as fortunate and are facing terror, displacement, and genocide still now in the 21st century. It is important that we always remember the atrocities that were committed during the Holocaust. We must use the Holocaust as a lesson that we pass on to our children and grandchildren. Those who wish to stifle the teaching of history's dark chapters are only enabling those kind of atrocities to reoccur. We are now seeing despicable acts in Ukraine, where freedom fighters, like those of the Warsaw Ghetto in 1943, are confronting brutal oppressors. We admire Holocaust survivors like Mr. T-Boom, who have dedicated their lives to sharing their stories. When I was young, my father shared with me stories of his experience during World War II. He was one of 80,000 American soldiers who took on the Nazi force of more than 250,000 in the Battle of the Bulge. After the war ended, my father was stationed at Nuremberg, where he was involved in the administration of the jail where Nazi war criminals were held as they were being tried, sentenced, and in some cases, executed. My father's stories affected me deeply. Later, I went and saw the grim remains of Dachau, and its chilling history made a lasting impact on me. When we remember the history of the Holocaust, we can move forward with a sharp eye towards ensuring that these crimes against humanity, never occur again. Here in Nashua, we have taken important steps to be more welcoming and compassionate to people of all backgrounds and ethnicities. We are proud to be a diverse community and an official welcoming city for our immigrants and refugees. There's still progress we need to make so that everybody feels welcome, safe, and supported. We must not become complacent, nor can we turn a blind eye when we see growing atrocities happening worldwide. As we solemnly vow, never again. And thank you for inviting me, and thank you for all for joining us on this important day of memorial.
I am a Holocaust survivor. I knew the real Nazis. This is how for a decade, speaking at this memorial, I begin my speech. I talk about what began in my country, where I lived as a little boy, the Netherlands, 82 years ago, and how my life was saved by brave and devout Christians. How far luckier was I than that beautiful girl in the photo that's in the monument right to my left, who's not much older than I was, and who died a horrible death in Auschwitz gas chamber shortly after that photo was taken. If you look at the tall monument next to me, it says on the other side, "Never forget." We want to remember the many millions of innocent victims who suffered so much during those terrible, terrible years. But if I could place this monument today, rather than about 10 years ago, I'd turn it around. For on the other side are carved the words, "Never again." Yes, those terrible years I just spoke of have started again in a democratic country called Ukraine. Just like Rotterdam, a big city in the Netherlands, was bombed to rubble by the Nazis in 1940, so Ukraine is today systematically being bombed to rubble by the Russians. Ukraine was invaded 2 months ago, incurring at this point more casualties than Rotterdam. The Dutch gave up in 5 days. 5 days, they gave up to the Nazis. But the Ukrainians keep on fighting, for they know if they surrender, there will soon be no more Ukrainians left in Ukraine. They will be killed or deported to Russia and never to be seen again. And that's why they fight in Ukraine. Shocking, shocking. The criminal conduct by the Russians parallels that of the Nazis during World War II. Never again could become a hollow slogan, because it's happening again. For those who believe that Ukraine will be the end of Putin's ambition, think again. the comparison of Putin's territorial ambitions this past decade is strikingly similar to Hitler's ambition in the 1930s. Let's take a look. Let's examine that. In March of 1936, Germany occupied the Rhineland, violating the Versailles Treaty. In March of 1938, Germany annexed Austria, called the Anschluss, or the Union. In October 1938, later that year, Germany occupied the Sudetenland, which was part of Czechoslovakia. And in March of 1939, Germany took the remainder of Czechoslovakia. And then, when nobody stopped them, and everybody tried to appease them, in September 1, 1939, Germany invaded Poland, and that was the start of World War II. Now let's examine that and compare that with Putin's ambitions. In April of 2000, Russia took control of Chechnya, an independent country, I would say. In August of 2008, Russia occupied 2 provinces of Georgia. In February of 2014, that's only 8 years ago, folks, Russia annexed the Crimea. Not a shot was fired. Everybody tried for peace. And what happened? In February of 2022, 2 months ago, Russia invades the Ukraine. Is that similar? Is that almost identical? Is history repeating itself? Both dictators have seized unchallenged absolute control of their country's government. Hitler's appetite for more and more power was only stopped after World War II started. Where and when will Putin's appetite for power stop? Is anyone here prepared to sacrifice their life, liberty, and fortune to stop him? It took more than 2 long years before the Americans declared war after Nazi Germany invaded Poland in September of 1939. 2 years before America entered the war. How long will it take before America enters the war after Putin invaded invaded Ukraine in February 2 months ago? Will it take chemical warfare? Will it take a tactical nuclear weapon? Will it take invasion of another NATO country? I believe that Putin is a reincarnation of Hitler, who himself was a reincarnation in the flesh of the devil. How long do we permit these devils to exist and continue to commit crimes against humanity? Is anyone here prepared to sacrifice their lives, liberty and fortune to stop Putin, as America and its allies finally stopped Hitler? For believe it or not, it will come to that. Never again has hollow meaning unless we are prepared to act. Ukraine, dependent on a document that I hope you've heard of called the Bucharest Memorandum, an agreement that the Ukraine signed in 1994 with the United States, Russia, England, France, and China. And that agreement caused Ukraine to dismantle and remove all of its nuclear weapons. All of them. Which at that time was the world's third largest nuclear stockpile. That agreement, which was not a treaty, but gave only assurances for mutual defense. So when Russia invaded the Crimea in 2014, it was clearly in violation of the Bucharest Memorandum, clearly in violation. And none of those 5 countries did anything. The United States did nothing. Nothing. They were paralyzed then, as they're paralyzed now, of the threat of Russian nuclear weapons. So ask yourself, would Russia have invaded the Crimea and now Ukraine if the Ukrainians had kept their nuclear weapons, which at the time was the world's third largest ICBM arsenal? I conclude this rather somber speech with the following exhortation. Bring us another Winston Churchill, an eloquent and resolute leader who stood up to Hitler when all those around him wanted to capitulate. Bring us a Winston Churchill to rid the world of Vladimir Putin so we can proudly proclaim never again. Thank you. I've introduced Carol Babel, who I met some time ago. She went to Israel and brought back, can I say this? She brought back some dirt, some rocks. She says, I can't say that, but I'm doing it. And in the monument are buried Israeli sand, Israeli rocks that she put in. She called me, a few weeks ago and said, are you doing anything about the Hashoah Remembrance? And I said, well, we haven't done it for 2 years, COVID and all the excuses. And I said, I'm getting old. And she said, shame on you, right?
Yes, I do.
Shame on you. So here she is, Carol Babel.
Mr. Mayor, Rabbi Jonathan, Mr. T-Boom, and guests, thank you very much for coming today and for continuing to have this ceremony. Holocaust survivors are dying, but their stories are more relevant today than they've ever been. In the past, 6 million people were executed during the Holocaust. Today, we may see more. We have a responsibility to prevent genocide in the future by international cooperation, committed to stopping these actions and bringing those who commit war crimes to justice. Our New Hampshire state motto is, live free or die. Today, you and I, standing here, are free. But in Ukraine, that is not the case. I was supposed to be in Ukraine yesterday. I have family there. I do summer missions work with the church there. But war broke out. There are no airports left in Ukraine for me to land in. I would have to land in another country and cross into Ukraine. I want to tell you a little story. We're going to start with my childhood and we're going to bring it forward to today and what you're seeing on television. So bear with me. My grandparents were Ukrainian. 3 of them were Ukrainian. 1 was born in Poland. In 1915 or so, my one grandfather came to America to work. He was 30 years old and he did not speak English. But he came here to work to earn money, to go back to Ukraine and build a house for his wife and his daughter. My grandmother and their daughter immigrated to the United States. They did not stay in Ukraine. It seems that my grandfather's letter writing was becoming less and less, and she was becoming more and more worried. So she came across the ocean to join her husband. They settled about 1 hour west of Philadelphia in a small town that was primarily Slavic people, because there was a steel mill in that town and they provided jobs to many people that they didn't have to speak English. Many Slavic people have since learned English. My grandfather, along with many other Slavic people, helped build a church that I attended as a young girl. He was first deacon of that church. My grandparents, those grandparents died when I was 9 years old. I could never talk to them because I don't speak Ukrainian or Russian, and they didn't speak English. This church is still in existence. It's over 100 years old now. In that town, at that time, this is back in 1954 when I was born, there were no synagogues. Today, there are 38 synagogues within a 30-mile radius of the town that I grew up in. So it didn't give me the opportunity to meet Jewish people when I was a young girl. I did read the book, Diary of Anne Frank. I found it amazing. In my 20s and 30s, when I lived in New England, in Connecticut, I had a Jewish landlord, so I learned a little bit more. My education regarding the Jewish faith and Jewish people didn't stop there. I've been to Israel 3 times, in 2005, 2007, and 2019. But something really amazing happened to me in Israel one night in 2007. I was in the swimming pool in the basement of the hotel, and an 80-year-old Jewish woman came in and we started talking. She was on vacation with her husband. They were from New York City area. And she asked me the question, have you been to the Holocaust Museum Memorial here in Israel? And I said, our group is going there tomorrow. And she stopped and thought, and she rolled her arm over to show me. And she said, do you know what this is? Now, I've watched documentaries and movies, I've looked at pictures and books. This woman was an Auschwitz survivor. What she was showing me was she was tattooed. I wanted to cry, I wanted to hug her, but we talked for a good hour. And like Fred says, and this memorial says, never forget, never again. This woman told me that she goes into schools and various organizations to lecture, to speak, to tell people about the Holocaust and what was done so that they would never forget. The next morning, our group went to the Holocaust Museum Memorial in Israel. And the way it is structured is they have barricades up, so as you go through, you feel trapped. And the effect is very, very effective. By the time you reach the end of the museum, it is not uncommon for people to be sitting on the floor weeping because there is a room that is rather round and it goes to the ceiling and it has pictures of people that were slain in the Holocaust. It is truly effective in getting the message across. I used to live in Nashua. I don't live in Nashua anymore, but I came downtown one day and I saw the sign for a Holocaust memorial here, and that got me really excited because our state motto is live free or die. So why would we have a Holocaust memorial here? And I walked through and I managed to call Fred, and he came down and he toured me through. And it is a blessing that our small state has such a wonderful memorial. My trip to Ukraine started about 7 years ago when I managed to find my family. I needed two things to go to Ukraine: a translator, because I don't speak the language, and I needed some place to stay, because in these remote villages and towns, there aren't hotels. And I had no way of knowing the condition that my family was in. Poverty is very high, especially in Western Ukraine. My first trip was 10 days to meet my family. And since that time, all my other trips have been about a month. Not only do I see my family, and they live in various places all over Ukraine, in Russia, in Crimea, but I also teach at a summer camp for children ages 6 to 18. It's a Christian camp. In 2020, I didn't go because the borders were closed due to the pandemic. So my last time in Ukraine was this past summer. When I did my family tree, the first trip to Ukraine, I learned something that has really resonated with me, because you have to understand the history of a country or what has happened in the past in order to understand what's happening now, today, what you're seeing on television. I learned that my grandfather had two sisters and a younger brother. His younger brother's name was Martin. He was 24 years old. Russia came into these small villages and towns. They rounded up all the young Ukrainian men and they took them. They have never been seen. They have never been heard of again. Did Martin go to Siberia? I rather doubt it. We have no body to put him to rest, along with all the other people that were taken. If this sounds familiar, this is exactly what Russia is doing today. In the town of Mariupol, which is still under siege, Russia has taken almost 400,000 Ukrainians across into Russia. They have taken 84,000 children, and not all of those children are with their parents. They've been taken. We will probably never see most of those people again. I was talking to my aunt. She's 86 years old, and she told me this story that affects our family. In 1945, her grandmother's brother and his family were taken. They lived in a town in western Ukraine. At 2 o'clock in the morning, the Russians pulled up with trucks. They put the men in one truck, and they put the women and the children in another truck, and they shipped them to various parts of Russia. It is amazing that this man's letter managed to reach his sister in America, and this was about 1945. The village that my grandparents came from, all of the shops there were owned by Jewish people. They're business people. The shops were beautiful. However, many Jews have been massacred in Ukraine. And as many of you know, Baba Yar in Kiev was a site where a little over 33,000 Jews were shot over a 2-day period. They have now turned that area into a museum center. And I was hoping to visit it this time during my visit to Ukraine. The major airport in Ukraine is in Kyiv. I don't spend a lot of time there, but due to the pandemic and flying in and out and having to take PCR tests, you wind up spending several days in Kyiv. So that was on my list of things to do and places to go. The church that I do work with is in western Ukraine. Right now, they are caring for a massive amount of refugees that are fleeing the areas that are being bombed. Today on TV, I heard that they're estimating that 5 million Ukrainians will flee the country. Right now it's sitting at 4 million, they're projecting 5 million. There are another 7 million Ukrainians that are homeless. Their buildings, their homes have been bombed. Their businesses have been bombed. They have nowhere to go. That is their country and they want to stay there. A little bit about Ukraine. It's about a little bit smaller than the state of Texas. It is the second largest country in Europe next to Russia. The population is 44 million. 260,000 are Jewish. 78% are Ukrainian. 17% are Russian. The military, 200,000 are active duty. There are 900,000 reservists. And then President Zelensky implemented martial law when the war started. So men ages 18 to 60 must stay in Ukraine and fight. So when you see on television primarily women and children, that's the reason you're not seeing the men, because they're in the country fighting and their wives and their children are leaving the country. As Fred said, Ukraine does not have any nuclear weapons. They were the third largest nuclear weapon holder in the world. They gave all their weapons up due to the Budapest Memorandum. Ukraine has 4 nuclear power plants and 15 nuclear reactors. And many of you have heard about Chernobyl in passing, and we'll touch a little bit on that. There's 14,000 miles of border with Russia in Ukraine. That's a lot of border. The majority of Ukrainians are Christians. 85% are Orthodox. Then there are Catholics, Protestants, Judaism, and Islam. The capital is Kiev, and that has 3 million people. The second largest city is Kharkiv in the northeastern border, and that is under bombardment as we speak with 1.4 million people. The third largest city is Odessa with 1 million people, and that is in the south. That is a port city. If Odessa falls and Ukraine becomes landlocked, Ukraine will not be able to export their goods or import goods. That's critical. That will continue to financially suffocate Ukraine. Ukraine is called the breadbasket of Europe. 10% of the world's wheat comes from Ukraine. Other big crops are potatoes, sunflower oil, barley, corn, and iron ore. In 1991, Ukraine became independent from Russia. And in 2019, President Zelensky was voted in. President Zelensky is Jewish, and he has lost family members in the Holocaust. Between 1991 and 2001, over 100,000 Jews left Ukraine, and many went to Israel. So now we're going to look at a little bit of history, because we're going to fast forward to what you're seeing today. There have been 3 forced famines in Ukraine. In 1921 and 22 was the first famine. In 1932 and 1933 was the second famine. They call that the Great Famine, or the Holodomor, which means death by hunger. In that famine, 3 to 5 million Ukrainians were starved to death. Stalin targeted Ukraine specifically to stop their independent movement. In 1946 and 1947 was the third famine. 2 million Ukrainians died there. Part of that, there was a drought in 1946. Today, as we speak, Ukraine and Western Ukraine farmers should be planting their fields, planting their crops. Their fields are being bombed and scorched. If they fail to produce, there will be another famine that will affect not only Ukraine, but all of Europe. In 1986, The Soviet-run Chernobyl nuclear power plant had a partial meltdown. Today, there's an 1,000 square mile exclusion zone around Chernobyl. And the Russians went into Chernobyl, and the reactor became dangerously unstable from what the experts are telling us. The Ukrainian authorities were tasked to evacuate everyone to Kyiv, while Moscow attempted to cover up the scope of the disaster at Chernobyl. As I mentioned, in 1991, Ukraine became independent. Ukraine is caring for thousands who have chronic illnesses and disabilities resulting from Chernobyl. The one thing I forgot to mention, I should have started this first, was between 1922 and 1991, Ukraine was absorbed into the USSR. When the Soviet Union collapsed, Ukraine declared its independence. But you see that Ukraine has been long subjugated, and it's been very difficult for them. As Fred mentioned, in 2014, Crimea to the south was annexed. I don't like the word annex. Let's tell it like it is. They were militarily taken and occupied, and they still are to this day. The composition of Crimea is 65% Russian, 15% Ukrainian, 12% Crimean Tatars. In 2014, there was a referendum, and the residents of Crimea were given two choices: for Crimea to go back and become part of the Soviet Union, or to be independent. The choice of it remaining with Ukraine was not given, therefore, most Ukrainians didn't vote. After the referendum, Russia passed out their passports. So everybody who lives in Crimea is considered a Russian citizen, including my family. They had no choice. If they didn't take Russian passports, their homes would have been taken from them. As it was, their church was taken and turned into a library. Also in 2014, Russia invaded the eastern border. They call it Donbass, and that is comprised of two regions, Donetsk and Luhansk. Separatist groups are backed by Russia in these areas, and they have been fighting since 2014. From 2014 until the war started in February of this year, 14,000 Ukrainian soldiers and civilians were killed trying to defend their border. The war there has ruined the area's economy and the heavy industries that were very productive there, and it forced millions to relocate. It is the world's most mine-contaminated area. I'll come back to that. It had coal and steel producing industries that have been bombed into the ground. Again, Russian passports have been handed out in those areas. And then Russia said, we're concerned about their safety because Ukraine is fighting. So then they went in. Russia invaded Ukraine. I have family in Donetsk. They left Donetsk and they went to Kyiv thinking that they would be safe there. They are not safe there. Today, you'll hear on the news about a city in southern Ukraine called Kherson. And the reason that's so important is they provide the water to Crimea. When Russia took Crimea, the Ukrainians cut the water supply to Crimea off. They said, you created this problem, you give them water. Today, you may have heard in the last day or so, the Russians are intending to hold a referendum in Kherson. Does this sound familiar, what they did in Crimea? And then Russia will pass out Russian passports and say that this is their territory. Kherson is important because of the water supply to Crimea. As I said before, Odessa is the third largest city in Ukraine. It's a port city, and it's critical to the financial health of the country. So where are we now? Family. Some of my family have fled the country into other countries, taking their children with them, losing their homes, losing their jobs, and their husbands are in Ukraine fighting. Some of my family have remained in large cities. One family stayed in a large city because their adult son had cancer and he was going to the hospital getting treatment. As you know, Russia has been bombing schools, churches, hospitals, and residential areas. In that particular city, they not only targeted that hospital, but they specifically targeted the cancer unit. Fortunately, my family member didn't get killed there. He and his parents fled to Western Ukraine, but because they had to flee, his cancer treatment stopped, and several weeks later he died. His parents took his body and drove it back to that city and were able to give their son a proper burial, which is a blessing because, as you know, as you've seen on the news, people are being slaughtered and killed and thrown into mass graves with no family, with no proper burial. My family in Crimea cannot leave, and I cannot go there. They're very concerned because their daughter and granddaughter left Crimea in 2015. Their daughter had been in the military at one time. She's a nurse, and she watches the world very carefully. And she knew what was coming, and she begged them to leave, to sell their properties and to leave, and they did not. So we still have family in Crimea. As I said today, there are about 11 million refugees. 4 million have fled into other countries, with more to follow. 7 million are homeless. There have been massive war crimes that are now being investigated and documented. I'll name some cities. You've heard of Bucha. Mariupol is currently still under siege. Kharkiv, Donbass, Kherson, and Odessa. As Fred mentioned, Russia has a history of going into countries and leveling them. He mentioned Chechnya. Russia went into Chechnya twice in the 1990s. In Georgia in 2008, in Syria in 2015, and in Ukraine today. I've mentioned that in Mariupol, we think that about 400,000 Ukrainians have been taken into Russia. Just last week, some of the civilians were allowed to go to a neighboring town, getting on buses thinking that they would be taken onto the Ukrainian side. They were taken into Russia. 84,000 children are now gone. We may never see them again. In Mariupol, recently, Ukrainians have been forced to dig mass graves in exchange to be given a little bit of food and water. Ukrainian men, we're hearing that they have been forced to start fighting with the Russians to come back into Ukraine and slaughter their own people. Russia's recruiting mercenaries from other countries to fight. Ukraine must win, because if they don't, Russia will not stop. President Putin has told us that it is his intention to rebuild the old Soviet Empire. There were 11 countries that broke away. He only has one back, Belarus. Russia wants to recover all their territory. Europe is not safe. Just yesterday, you probably have heard on the news that Russia stopped providing fuel to Poland and Bulgaria because they refused to pay them in rubles. As I mentioned, a famine is coming. I mentioned to you about the Holocaust Memorial Center, Baba Yar in Kyiv. A committee was put together only in 2016 under President Poroshenko, and this museum, the Memorial Center, it was scheduled to be opened in 2025. Over 100,000 people have been killed in and near this center. In October of 2021, that's not that long ago, this center released the first 161 names of Nazi soldiers who committed crimes there. President Zelensky, our Ukrainian president, said, "What is the point of saying never again for 8 years if the world stays silent when a bomb drops on the same site of Babin Yar?" On February 25th, the day after the war that started in Ukraine, Zelensky released a Twitter saying, "Europe said never again, but here we are." Since we are at a Holocaust memorial today, I would like to acknowledge two people. They were Holocaust survivors that have been killed in Ukraine. In March, a 96-year-old man was killed in Kharkiv. His name was Boris Romanchenko. He survived 4 concentration camps during World War II. The building he lived in was hit by Russian missiles, and he was killed. In April 4th, a 91-year-old woman was killed in Mariupol. Her name was Vanda Obidkova. As a 10-year-old girl, she survived the 1941 Jewish massacre in Mariupol by hiding in a cellar. In April, she was hiding in a cold basement when the building she lived in was bombed and she was killed. We're saying never again, but it's happening all over again. It's why having these Holocaust memorials is so important, and having these ceremonies are so important, so that we will not forget. Unfortunately, we say never again, but it's happening as we speak. We're looking at a very basic concept, and I'd ask you to reflect on good versus evil. You may ask, what can I do? You can choose to be on the side of good. Your prayers for peace are so welcomed and important. Financial support to Ukraine to help the refugees and Ukraine military is really needed. The first wave of humanitarian aid from many different countries has now all been distributed in Ukraine. They have a lot of people to feed, including their own military. I have a table set up. You're welcome to come over. I have a map of Ukraine showing the different regions. If you're not familiar with it, that may be helpful to you. I'd like to thank Fred for giving me the opportunity to come and share with you today. I say in Hebrew, Shalom, Shalom, peace, peace to you. I also say Slava, Slava, glory to Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol. I'm freezing to death. So we're going to close this out. We can have a round table if anybody wants to. We can set up some tables, we can gather some chairs together, whatever you wish. But the formal program is done. Mary, you're freezing. You can go back to your warm office. Am I done?
Good.
Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Fred.
And folks, one last point. There's not a big crowd here, and because the telegraph has kind of died, even though we have a telegraph reporter here today. But we do have camera coverage, YouTube coverage. We're going to have repeated programs on Nashua Community Channel, all the three channels, I hope, government, education, and public, right? He says, right. And that's why it's important. So even though there are a few people here, hopefully this carries forward. And thank you for telling us about Ukraine. Folks, if you want to meet in the round table and you speak, please do so.